could you talk about some learning disabilities that are forms of autism or are related in some way to autism, like not just Asperger's, but dyslexic, dysgraphia, ADD, ADHD, and anyone I might have forgotten.
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's plenty. And so there are certain things that kind of go with Asperger's, and usually most, not all, but most people with Asperger's or autism spectrum disorders struggle with some level of anxiety. Sometimes that anxiety can be an obsessive compulsive disorder, and there are two ways you can look at it. One is the obsessive compulsive disorder is a separate diagnosis, or another is it's kind of part of the Asperger's. It's a little bit of both. Same thing with attentional issues. Now, a person can have a coexisting diagnosis of ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which kind of means that even if they didn't have an autism spectrum disorder, they would still have an attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. There's a lot of other people with spectrum disorders who have attentional problems that seem specifically related to the autism spectrum, and they kind of tune out and they're in their own world and they lose attention, but it's really related to the autism spectrum as opposed to a deficit in attention. Many people with spectrum disorders have difficulty with writing, and there's two different pieces. There's a mechanical part of writing, but there's also they have struggled with writing essays and with abstract comprehension. Different, like you mentioned, dysgraphia. Dysgraphia is actually a term used more by I think speech therapists or occupational therapists than psychologists. But so different professions sometimes have different terms when they're describing the same thing, and you often find that. So a term can be used by one profession and a different term is used by another profession, but they're actually describing the same thing. Certainly very, very common that people on the spectrum have learning disabilities. Very interesting too that people on the spectrum tend to either be geniuses in math, or they might have learning disabilities in math, or they might be one area of math they have a real expertise, but other areas of math they struggle. When you come across those issues, you would treat, so if somebody has a learning disability in math, whether they are on the spectrum or not, you would kind of try to work with it the same way. Same is true for issues around anxiety or attentional issues. You work with it the same way you would work with a person who's not on the spectrum. So, but that's often the case for people on the spectrum. They have all these other coexisting issues that are either part of their spectrum diagnosis or coexisting with their spectrum disorder.
Okay. Can you did you talk about dyslexia? We talk about that's a reading disability.
Yeah.
Can you define that?
Yeah, oftentimes, people with dyslexia, and again, as you said, that's a reading disability, so not part of the spectrum per se, but people might have that. And oftentimes there's a reversal in letters, so that they, B's might look as D's. And
Q's and P's.
Right, so they mix up letters like that, so they need, some extra support in reading. So somebody who has that might be pulled out of their class and get one-on-one or small group attention for reading, or there may be certain reading programs that reading specialists work with them on.
Okay.